I am sure there's an adage about this somewhere, but I have to tell you, Rye, I am seriously regretting complaining about the heat last week because I'm convinced it has only gotten worse.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. It reminds me out of the frying pan and into the fire. I saw this stat from Ben Knoll, who's actually a weather and meteorologist here in the Hudson Valley, and he said the Hudson Valley was actually in the top 5 of the most humid places on Earth one of the days last week.
Exactly. I mean, can you imagine Hudson Valley being top 5%? That's crazy. It certainly felt like a tropical rainforest. I can tell you that.
I know, deep in the Amazon, right? But with the heat and everything else, it really actually has been a challenging week. And as I'm sure many of you listening in will agree, for everyone, regardless of where we are, what we believe, our political views, you can't deny that it has been a difficult, challenging, and frankly, a tense week.
Exactly. I mean, you have the fallout from Hurricane Beryl continues, a record-breaking storm costing billions in economic damages and taking the toll of human lives from the Caribbean to Texas all the way to Vermont. The heat itself. Though we are fortunate enough to be having this conversation right now in the comfort of Newlab in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, 140 million people across the country are under heat alerts for the very real danger it poses to human health, especially for the vulnerable and the elderly.
Yeah, I know. I heard that actually from Beryl, over 32 million people actually lost power in Texas and are struggling for 5 days at least.
All of those challenges with the weather, and of course, what happened on July 13th in Pennsylvania, which we're not going to go into detail on, but we'll simply say that echoing the statement by the White House that there's no place in America, in this democracy, for political violence.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more. There is really no place in anywhere, frankly, for political violence.
And you have each of those acute issues, those things that we are confronting on a daily basis directly amidst the backdrop of an increasingly difficult and challenging social and economic landscape with rising costs, the difficulty of even just going and being able to purchase groceries, shortages of housing, unrest and armed conflict from across the globe. Factors that we know are affecting so many. And for you listening in, you either feel that yourself or you know someone who is affected. And it has created this prevailing lack of certainty and clarity and a sense among many of hopelessness. Now, to take a step back, for those just tuning in for the first time, to be clear, this isn't a show about politics. It's not about debating across the aisle. Nor is it about debating the science. No, Planet First Action is a show about the future that we are living today and the history we are continuing to write each and every day.
It's a show about understanding what is driving job creation. What are the jobs of today? What are going to be the jobs for tomorrow? And what does it mean for communities, businesses, and policymakers? Frankly, for everyone.
That's exactly it. And especially in times of disruption, to be able to focus in on those jobs and understand what is going to be that future, that state of in terms of what is how we spend our daily lives. Planet First Action is a show about learning from the leaders on the front lines who are driving these initiatives forward. We began the series with incredible insights from Cam Lawrence, the CEO of Newlab. And last week, we had the privilege of starting the conversation with Tony Curnes, the founding partner of Purpose Venture Group. And here's just a clip of some of that conversation.
What can you share with our audience from what you've been working on actually in order to support the Power Forward communities?
Absolutely. So for a little bit of background, one of the major projects that we've worked on over the course of the last year is supporting Power Forward Communities, which is a coalition of 5 nonprofit entities in an application to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to decarbonize housing in particular is the focus of PFC's application. And so the coalition members are Rewiring America, Enterprise Community Partners, LISC, Habitat for Humanity, and United Way. And our strategy was awarded $2 billion by the EPA.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's super exciting. And now the hard work begins to deploy the money. And so really the orientation of our application, as I mentioned, was decarbonizing housing, which, as we know, is a particularly hard to decarbonize sector. Solar and transportation also are key sectors being focused on by this program. And those were really strategies that were picked up and run with by other coalitions who were also awarded.
And I got to say, many of you from hearing that clip, if you didn't listen to last week's episode, are probably feeling the same, but we are so excited to continue that conversation with Tony here today in part 2 in just a moment on this stage. And while we admit we are chomping at the bit, for those of you listening in who haven't heard the first episodes in the series yet, hit pause, go back, check them out first, and then come back.
That's right, Jay. From Cam's insights in the first 2 episodes as he leads the incredible team at Newlab to support the companies who are literally building the future today in their Brooklyn location, as well as at their second location on Ford's campus in Detroit, to the unique insights Tony was able to share in part 1 last week as to what is changing the social and economic landscape.
Exactly, and specifically what Tony was able to share as one of the leaders behind the successful award of the $2 billion that Power Forward Communities received as a part of the program. His insights on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, that $27 billion, which, as if you listen to last week's episode, and really as you listen to every episode in this series, you'll see just how incredibly important it is. I mean, even in fact, as Tony shared, the program is still very much a work in progress. That so much of the way in which it is going to be deployed is still being designed today. And with that, just how incredibly important it is for communities, for companies, for leaders to get engaged, even to just start by going and reading who the different awardees are and what was the foundation for their award. And as we prepared for the conversation this week with Tony, doing our research with the team and with our executive producer, Julien, during what was, as we said, a very challenging week, we had this moment of deja vu. And I don't know if this has happened to any of you listening in, where it's almost this sort of deja vu that's not personal, but almost broader, as in the echoes of history kind of deja vu. Maybe it's because when you're deeply reading into history and the writing is compelling, it can mentally transport you to that time and place. I'm sure many of you have felt that with your favorite books, but this week, for Ryan and I and the team, it brought to mind this revelation that as a country, with the challenges we face today, with the difficulty of this past week, with all of that, we have been here before, even with the issue of what happened on July 13th at the rally in Butler, Pennsylvania.
Exactly. Think about it. April 1865, following the country's most divisive period, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. It left the country in a dark turmoil with public that's not even sure if this experiment in democracy that is the United States today would even survive. I know many in this country on both sides of the aisle have shared similar fears today, and I'm sure many of you listening in have heard or felt it yourself. Though it may not have been clear at the time, that turmoil and those challenges have set the stage for what would be the beginning of a new era in American entrepreneurship, innovation, and leadership. The building of a new world by U.S. companies and organizations driven by both competition as well as partnership.
Exactly. And to today's all too familiar backdrop for everyone listening in of intense polarization, increasing challenges, it seems that the stage is being set once again for history to at least echo with that dawning of a new era of entrepreneurship, innovation, and leadership. And some of you listening in might be asking, well, okay, that's all well and good, but why are we talking about Abraham Lincoln? Why are we talking about the 1800s? Why are we looking at history? Why are we doing that, Ryan?
Well, first of all, Jay, it's quite simple. Past is predicate of the future, right? That's what they say. And the reality is that the decisions that we make today and the leaders we support and choose to follow, those decisions have outsized implications on our lives, on our children, on our ability as a global community to be able to continue to live on this planet.
Not to mention, we just love history.
That's also true.
But seriously, that is exactly right. While the disruptions of today and the challenges we face are in many ways unprecedented, the truth is we can learn so much. We can be so much better equipped for the challenges of today by studying the past, by looking at the leaders who stepped up and by their actions and through their leadership shaped history in a way that continues to impact the lives that we live today. To the importance of history, to quote William H. Hastie Jr., an American lawyer, judge, educator, public official, and civil rights advocate, and the first African American to serve as the governor of the United States Virgin Islands as a federal judge and as a federal appellate judge, history informs us of past mistakes from which we can learn without repeating them, but it also inspires us and gives us confidence and hope bred of victories already won.
And especially with something like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, you might look at it and say, wow, that's $27 billion. Many people, including many of you listening in yourselves or people you might know, might question that size of investment being deployed by the federal government. But the truth of the matter is that in that regard, that kind of mobilization by the federal government does have precedent.
Exactly. There's certainly those questions being asked. And to your point, Ryan, that is something that there is clear precedent for. I mean, just look at the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, which is something we're going to get into in more detail in future episodes. But the initial investment alone was, in today's inflation-adjusted terms, almost $300 billion. And while the challenges of today are unprecedented, what is consistent is our leadership. In the face of extreme challenges, the American engine of innovation and entrepreneurship, of communities of everyday people, and our leaders and international partners have risen up to face that challenge. The difference is today that the challenge we face will dictate the future of this planet and our ability to live on it.
Yep. And that is why we need leaders like Cam Lawrence and his team at Newlab, and why we need leaders like Tony Curnes and his team at Purpose Venture Group.
Leaders who, like so many of the historical figures of the last 2 centuries in this country, who shaped modern life, are bringing their expertise and experience from separate and distinct industries and careers in order to focus in on the most pressing issues we face today.
That's right. Those leaders who can inspire us, can teach us, can truly lead these massive undertakings that are being mobilized today. And it is by the efforts of leaders like Cam and Tony that the next pages of history will be written.
And as we get ready to continue this conversation with Tony Curnes, to get each of those things, the insights, the inspiration, the guidance, we would just remind everyone listening that these challenges we face today will not be solved by a small group alone. And for the outcomes to be truly just and equitable, all communities need to be informed and to participate.
That's right. And to the power of our collective communities in determining the success of our enterprises as a country, we couldn't have said it better than Abraham Lincoln himself, who wisely stated, "Public sentiment is everything. And with public sentiment, nothing can fail. And without it, nothing can succeed." Consequently, he who molds public sentiment goes deeper than he who enacts statutes or pronounces decisions. He makes statutes and decisions possible or impossible to be executed.
And as world-changing, as incredibly important as the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is, as that $27 billion of investment is in building the future, just realize that from what Lincoln has said, as important as that is, your engagement, your awareness of the situation, your sentiment about it, and your contribution to it is just as, if not more, important. And so it is to each of us to look to our leaders, to learn from them, and to ultimately contribute to the success of the work for our collective future. As Tony shared, just go and even start by reading the details of what has been passed and who has been awarded that $27 billion. And we could not be more excited to continue this conversation on stage here at Newlab with Tony Curnes, the founding partner of Purpose Venture.
Our application, as I mentioned, was decarbonizing housing, which, as we know, is a particularly hard to decarbonize sector. Solar and transportation also are key sectors being focused on by this program, and those were really strategies that were picked up and run with by other coalitions who were also awarded. And so as we think about decarbonizing housing, there are really two elements to the problem, both of which are being addressed by GGRF dollars. One is just the availability of capital, particularly in low-income and disadvantaged communities. And as you may know, there was a requirement that a minimum of 40% of these dollars directly go to financing decarbonization projects in those communities. Our application set a much higher target. So we're looking at about 80% of the dollars going directly to those communities. And it's something that it's really core to the mission of all 5 coalition members. So it felt very natural to really set that high target for ourselves.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think as the audience that's listening in may be realizing, Tony, to your credit, you are not a boastful person, but you are, at the end of the day, one of the people that has been instrumental in the creation of Rewiring America and the creation of Power Forward Communities. And to that, what you just said to very candidly, but is really warrants more attention, is that award of $2 billion to really making a difference in disadvantaged communities and helping them to decarbonize, especially when it comes to their housing stock. And that is something that should not be overlooked. And we applaud your efforts in that. And also why we're so grateful to have you here now to ask these questions, because I know there's so many people in the audience, whether it's other policymakers, the business owners, also the investors who are trying to think about how it's going to impact them, to have you to ask that question. What would you share with them? How do you think that they should start to think about this rollout of this money? And another thing, to your credit, knowing that you've been given a very short runway, it's going to be all working through plans now. I think the EPA has a deadline of distributing it all by September, and so it's a fast timeline in that regard as well. So we'd just love to hear what your advice is for stakeholders looking to prepare.
Absolutely. So there's because it's federal funding, there's a traditional federal procurement process that that EPA is coordinating with coalition members about the parameters around, and so that is something that is just part of the receiving and distributing federal dollars that's worth familiarizing organizations that are going to apply. It's worth spending time familiarizing yourself with that. And otherwise, I would say the original notice of funding opportunity is really good and worth reading. And I would say if your focus is housing, really PFC is a great place to spend time. All of the applications are public. All of the winning applications are public, so they can be viewed and read through. And we're executing on the strategy that we laid out in the application, and so are the other winning coalitions. And so I think that's really the right place to dive in.
Perfect. That's super helpful. And again, for the audience that's listening in, that is, again, one of the points of Planet First Action is to make that very valuable information readily accessible and available. And so you'll be able to see that in the show notes. You'll be able to see that on the website. We'll put the links to all the things that Tony just mentioned that are worth familiarizing yourself with, so they're easy to access.
Sure, absolutely. So now when you start thinking about, and a lot of our viewers and a lot of our listeners here are startups, right? So they see and they understand, okay, well, there's actually a huge effort that's going on in this country in order to kind of help drive these missions forward. And oftentimes that actually aligns up with more or less kind of their business mission as well. So what advice would you actually give these startups in terms of, okay, well, look, I actually have something to contribute, or I could possibly contribute to this mission. How do I actually get involved with this?
I would say certainly there's the opportunity to directly receive funding in certain instances. I think beyond that, there is I would say that's absolutely one place to focus. Another is just to get engaged in communities like going back to Planet First Action. There are such a variety of ways that folks who are part of this community and others think about making impact, and I know it's certainly enriched my thinking, and I think that I would highly recommend that.
Excellent.
It's great, and I think that idea of the community, the importance of kind of getting engaged just generally, is incredibly important. And it ties to one of the things that we talk about a lot, which is for the fantastic policy that's been put in place, especially when you're talking about things like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. There are so many opportunities that are out there, but there's also a gap between the actual opportunity that's there versus the people who know about it, or just the general awareness of what's going on. I don't know what the latest stats is in terms of the general population's knowledge of what IRA stands for, or that it's even focused on sustainability in many regards. But that's something that we talk about a lot at Gordon and Frost, which is what does it take to enable impact? Part of it just being general awareness. So when you're thinking about the GGRF, whether it's through Power Forward Communities or any of the awardees, how are you thinking about the balance of that investment in terms of what's most impactful, going straight into communities and actual decarbonization of a building versus efforts around elevating awareness for those to actually get more involved and to be a part of the solution?
Absolutely, and this goes to the realizing I actually didn't finish the second point of where the GGRF dollars are going. So one is directly to financial assistance for decarbonization projects. The other is really around market building activities. And so the theory of the case there, and this is what we put forth in our application that the PFC application that I think EPA really liked, is that we want to build a set of products, tools, communication strategies that really allow communities to engage with decarbonization in the most effective manner. And so just to give you an example of a Rewiring America product that served as kind of a test case for this, at Rewiring America, the team has put together this product called the Personal Electrification Planner. And what you can do as a homeowner or a renter is go and put in all the information about the energy systems in your home, and what this product will serve up to you is an electrification plan. And so then it will say, your furnace is likely to be due for an upgrade within the next 3 years, say, and here are some options for how you might be able to electrify and transition to a heat pump system. If you were to want to put rooftop solar on your house, this is what it might cost, and this is the potential benefit, et cetera, et cetera. And so it takes what is a very complex process and turns it into something that we can wrap our heads around in terms of, okay, this is a path that makes sense to me and that's financially viable for me as a homeowner or a renter. I can hand it to my landlord and say,
yeah,
consider this.
It's funny because it kind of comes back to the point you made earlier of a lot of the work in the space for success to be realized is about translating. And so translating what's going on, translating this policy to what does that mean for communities specifically? How do they take advantage of it? And that goes actually to one of the things that we love about the work that you do at Purpose Venture Group, which is specifically not just making impact-oriented companies successful, but really about uplifting underserved communities.
That's right.
And helping get those who have been historically disadvantaged to be able to be a part of this green transition, because it is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity in a lot of ways in terms of the investment that's going into it right now. I think actually Purpose Venture Group shared recently on social media online that ensuring the success of the GGRF direct pay and other climate policies focused on those underserved communities is a core focus of the team across a whole bunch of client engagements, and you're proud to be doing that with companies like Milken, Banyan, and other CDFI and CDCU-oriented companies. This is something as a topic that we spend a lot of time talking about at Gordon and Frost, and Ryan and I especially, is the challenge of being able to really reach out and connect with communities that have historically been sidelined in a lot of ways and been disadvantaged and don't necessarily have a lot of trust in terms of what's going on at a higher level. With that being the case, we'd just love to learn for the work that you've been doing and how you think about what's coming forward with the GGRF. What does that look like in terms of actually being able to engage those disadvantaged communities and get them to be a part of the transition, give them the tools and the resources that they need? What does that look like?
Absolutely. I think it goes back to a lot of listening to start. And I think we have an idea of what electrification looks like for a home, but then when you go into community, for instance, Rewiring America has been doing a lot of electrification work in Georgia. And one thing the team found when they went there is that there is a lot of preparatory work that needs to be done before someone can think about really electrifying their home. They may need weatherization. Their electrical wiring might be not up to standard, or it might be even dangerous for the resident. And so there's a conversation with the resident about what are the basic things about their home. They may not have air conditioning. And so what are the basic things about the home that really speak to quality of life? And then that's from addressing those, we can get to a place where the resident can really view electrification as a benefit, not just for the climate, but for their own quality of life, which is so important.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's such an important point, is that especially for those of us who spend our time working in this industry specifically, we see decarbonization as one of this incredible goals. And obviously it doesn't stand alone. There's things like protecting biodiversity and other things that are just important as concrete pillars to focus on. But we focus so much on that term of decarbonization. But when you switch to the mindset of the average person, the average home, the average family, it's like that doesn't necessarily mean anything. It really is, to your point, it's about what is it that actually improves your quality of life? What are the things that you actually need? And so that is important work, what you're doing in that regard, and what the team over at Rewiring America is doing, is being able to say, yes, this is a policy that's focused on decarbonization, but this is what it actually means at a human level for those families.
Yeah, what I find actually really interesting about that comment is that, again, how do you actually bring this particular community along with you? And oftentimes what you'll have is you more or less kind of have this dichotomy of saying, okay, well, you want to decarbonize, but at what expense? What do I have to give up in order to actually decarbonize? So it's either you have to spend more money or you basically have to shift over. It's almost like going organic or going vegetarian. It's actually just more expensive to do that as opposed to actually just having, food that's not as good for you, right?
We're going to ask you about your dietary preferences in just
so
a little bit.
Exactly. That is definitely coming. So it's just really interesting just in terms of being able to look at that. And so I think what's really interesting about the work that you're doing specifically is that actually you can actually do both at the same time. So at the end of the day, what we're talking about is that these communities can actually go through with these grants that the government is actually giving them and the tax rebates and say that, okay, well, you know what, I can actually, take off 75% of the actual price of this particular item that I'm getting, and then actually just get a much better quality of life. So I think that's just
Exactly.
really exciting in terms of some of the work that you guys are doing.
Exactly, and that's all been made possible by federal policy. But then now the work has to
Gotta
be
get it
done to get it to ground.
It's an important subject that's worth spending even just a little bit more time on, especially because we did have it's our third and final follow-up question from that we didn't get to from the March event, which was actually shared by Zach from Boston Impact Initiative, which is what we've been talking about right now. How do you make sure that these underserved communities, and especially historically Black and brown communities, are prioritized, knowing that they're going to be disproportionately impacted by climate change? There's obviously a lot that's put into the policy specifically, whether it's Justice 40 or even just some of the objectives of things like the GGRF. What do you think are some of the other things that we should be reinforcing to keep top of mind to make sure that those communities actually are prioritized throughout this work?
I think it's certainly not just federal policy. I think I also think about state and local policy a lot. I know NYSERDA has been doing some really excellent work here in New York, thinking about how to really have low-income and disadvantaged communities become leaders in electrification. And just a company that I was speaking with last week, you introduced me to, Dollaride, here in New York City, is doing fantastic work in partnership with NYSERDA, electrifying dollar vans that are based in low-income communities here in New York City. And so there's so much entrepreneurial spirit that is certainly in this city, but really spread throughout the country, and that can be brought to bear with models that perhaps aren't familiar to the average person, but where there's a lot of potential.
Yeah, it's funny because that idea is something that we're going to probably spend a lot of time talking about in this series, Ryan and I, is the importance of being local, because at the end of the day, it all comes back to what's happening on the ground where you are, and that ends up being aggregated into countries and hemispheres and all of the bigger units. But at the end of the day, it really is local to start. It's important, especially when it comes to talking about underserved communities, the reality of being local. And it's also one of the things that we really love about Newlab's approach, because they take specifically in terms of their thesis of how they support these ventures, these ecosystems, is being place-based, because it has to be tied to the community for it to truly be impactful, for it to be successful. When we think about, speaking of Newlab, when we think about the ecosystem writ large, there's obviously a lot of focus on the transformation of the climate tech capital stack, which we have to give our credit to Sophie Purdom and the team over at CTVC in terms of making sure that term is in the vernacular. But besides the capital side of itself, there's also a lot of transformation happening in terms of the ecosystem, and especially the entrepreneurial support organizations that are coming online to support those ventures and those initiatives. As we said at the top, we could not be more honored and privileged to be partnering with Newlab for this series, to be having this conversation on this stage, which has got such an incredible place already in climate and sustainability history, and just an incredible value symbolically of what it really means to be leading at the forefront of this incredible work. So when you're thinking, again, about, to kind of bring it back to what we were talking about before, supporting organizations who are trying to scale and grow, make what they're doing investable for the broader sort of investor pool that they're talking to. How do you think about engaging organizations like a Newlab? What time does that come in? How do you bring them in to support the clients that you work with?
Definitely. I think the way that we've always thought about partnerships is really first going back to investors and capital. And so much of our work is oriented around helping founders understand what it is that investors are looking for and how to create a strategy around capital raising and deployment that's going to be attractive. That we are constantly in dialogue with investment firms and have this partnership formally with Systemic Capital to really advance that part of our mission. As it relates to Newlab, I still remember the first time I came into this building, such an incredible facility. And what the team has done with it, and the work that's been done in it, and the companies that have been incubated here. It's really an inspiration, and it's a model that I think other folks have tried to replicate, but no one has done it quite this way.
It's so true. I mean, when you start thinking about, at the end of the day, we talked about over 300 companies have actually walked across this stage, and over $3 billion actually have been raised by the companies that actually have been fostered by Newlab, which I feel is just incredible. But let's actually take a little bit of a break and pause right now and talk a little bit about, okay, well, looking forward. Thinking about, okay, well, we could talk about the next, 5 years and 10 years, but honestly, there's going to be a lot of change that happens within really the next 6 months. So, and when you start talking about the next 6 months, really the first thing that comes to mind, probably almost the only thing that comes to mind, is the election. It's going to be a big deal. We all know that at the end of the day, a lot of the change and the understanding in terms of what's actually going to be applied on the ground is going to be coming from the top. So what advice would you give our audience in terms of how would you actually kind of manage that transition and some of those changes that may happen?
Definitely. I think it's one of the things that I was trained to do as an investor back at Centerbridge was to scenario plan. And so I think that has to be part of every founder or organization strategy to understand, try to understand what the world might look like in two pretty different states of the world, and then a lot of shades of gray, even from those two potential states of the world, in terms of sub-scenarios from there. And so that's going to be a different question for every organization, and some scenarios might look more dramatically different if there's a company that is more directly supported by policy, where there might be a policy reversal, versus a company that might be more insulated. But I think now is definitely the time to start scenario planning. And I think also just to say, we have lived through a lot of changes already over the last couple of decades in terms of not just administration, but economic status, interest rate, environment, just the innovation that's been available. And there's never going to be less innovation available to try to solve these problems as there is right now. And that's always going to be true for the future as well. So I think that's something we can always return to.
Yeah, and I think just one other kind of mention on that as well, I think it also speaks very highly in terms of actually how the IRA specifically was actually rolled out, because it wasn't actually distributed, in one particular area or another. It had very much a very concerted effort in terms of making sure that the entire country was basically uplifted, and there's a lot of jobs and a lot of opportunity that was actually provided to everyone across the board. So I think that will just kind of help the fact that it will be more embedded, because there's just simply more benefit for everyone.
Absolutely, and that's so true. And I think the one of the pieces of work that I see being done very well over in England, we were hearing about this today, is really connecting green infrastructure with value for local communities. And so if you are a community that has a wind farm or a solar farm close by, there's great work being done in England to actually return that value to the local community and really have them see the benefit of that infrastructure. And I think IRA really goes a long way to creating that environment in the U.S. as well.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense, and it's actually something we're excited to get into in one of our next episodes in terms of that importance of equity at a local level in terms of these solutions, and how that makes the sustainable impact that much greater. To kind of move from the hard question about the election to a slightly easier question. One of the things that Plan First Action is really focused on is, as we said, it's about bringing together these different types of stakeholders who wouldn't necessarily come together in the room at the same time to have that dialogue specifically focused on facilitating action. And that's, we know, is something that you have to do through your work at Purpose Venture Group on behalf of your clients. And so with that being said, knowing that each of these different types of stakeholders are in the audience, we'd love to just take a moment to say, as Ryan just mentioned, looking forward, what is the advice that you would give to each of them? Starting with the founders, especially those who have an impact mission, who are trying to bring it to life as a company, but don't necessarily have yet the financial literacy and don't know what it takes to actually make sense for investors, and who haven't yet had a chance to work with Purpose Venture Group in doing that. What advice would you give them?
I would say, first of all, the early stage investors in this ecosystem are amazingly supportive. Whether there's a capital need right now or not, I've always found them willing to spend time with early stage founders and get to know them and to convey what it is that they're looking for in investments. So I think going directly to potential investors is a great place to focus. We're always happy to have a conversation and share whatever we can share about what we know, but investors certainly are great places to spend time on that question.
Well, funny enough, that actually leads directly into my question about investors. But those who actually, what would you actually tell investors and why they actually should start investing in climate-oriented companies when these investors actually typically kind of either ignore or basically aren't thinking about it in that way?
Definitely. I think, I go back to my career at Centerbridge where one of the industries I invested in was insurance. And at that point in time, the last decade, we weren't really yet thinking about how the insurance markets were going to be affected by climate. I know certainly some insurance markets were, but as a sector at large, that wasn't really a major part of the conversation. But I just give that example to say that no matter what sector you're investing in, if you're not yet investing in climate, you are going to be effectively investing in climate if you aren't already, just because of the ways that climate is going to impact your sector. And so I think it's really started, the place I would recommend folks start is really exploring how climate will impact the sector that you invest in, and starting to develop a thesis there. And then, because that's really where you can bring a lot of expertise to bear already, and then moving out from that.
It's about actually getting ahead of it at the end of the day.
Exactly.
Because at the end of the day, we know the trends are going to be continuing. Yep. So your advice is actually just making sure that you actually just stay ahead, and then that way you actually mitigate the risk as you guys start moving forward. Yeah.
It's interesting because it also brings to mind a conversation we were having with some investors just recently down at the Co-Mobility Summit in Chattanooga. And those two investors were specifically focused on the mobility space and auto and transportation. And it was a panel discussion that we were having with them that we were privileged to speak on about what is, again, the impact of sustainability when it comes to investing in mobility specifically. And it was interesting to hear their perspectives because at this stage, those two firms, they had not yet brought formally into their thesis sustainability as a component that's guiding their investment decisions. But what they were seeing is that it was coming in regardless. It was effectively table stakes because there are very few players in the automotive or transport space that are not already working to apply sustainability. Which is an interesting thing to see. It's great, it's great to see that that's happening. But I guess a question as a follow-up would be for you, do you think that it is beneficial for investors to proactively put sustainability into their thesis to help guide their selection? Or do you think it's more, as you said, start doing the research at this stage, focus on the sector that you're focused on, and learn about how it's going to come into mind at whatever stage it is, and account for it as it does, or just be more proactive now?
I think being proactive is always going to be the strategy that I would recommend. I think the really interesting thing about investing is that you have a responsibility to your LPs to manage their capital well, but you also have a responsibility to use the capital that you have to attempt to create the world that you want to live in and want to have future generations live in. And so I think that is a really interesting challenge for investors. It was one of the things I always enjoyed about investing. And so I think holding those two things in mind, but not letting the latter one drop in terms of remembering that capital is ultimately just a tool to serve humanity, and right. How do we do that most effectively?
That's such an important distinction.
That's a great quote. That might be the headline for for today's episode. And we'll put a little disclaimer at the bottom. This is not investment advice for you. We'll make sure we include that in there. It brings to mind again this looking forward and what investors are going to be having in mind certainly, but that next set of stakeholders, which is the policymakers. Right now, we're focused on deployment. Hashtag deploy. If you follow Jigar Shah's LinkedIn feed,
definitely,
and that is certainly going to remain the focus for the short term. But again, looking forward, what would you want to see more of in an IRA 2.0? What would you, or maybe another way to phrase that, what would you share with policymakers right now for them to start thinking about applying lessons from what you've seen so far?
That's a really great question. I'm eager to do the work on GGRF. We've got our partner PFC to support in deployment. We have another client, Hope, which will be deploying a Solar for All grant as well. And so I feel like personally I'll have a lot more to say about that question 6-9 months down the line. But I think that the burden is really on us now to deploy the massive amount of capital that the ecosystem has received wisely, and to then give feedback on what's worked, what hasn't, and what to do next.
Right. So we've talked a lot about, we've talked about now with the entrepreneurs, we've talked about what's going on from a policy perspective, we've talked about what's going on from an investment perspective. Now, the last one we're going to talk about is actually from a private market perspective, right? So what's going on in terms of the private sector and how they should actually get involved in. And at the end of the day, they're going to be forced to get involved, because when you start talking about it, we already mentioned it already in the show here, Local Law 97. That's a real thing. And that's just one of this. That's basically what's happening here in New York City. But Boston's rolling out very similar initiatives. California has a whole slew. When you start looking at a statewide level, there's just tons rolling out. So what would you actually give these private sector companies advice in terms of how they need to get involved, and then actually how they actually need to make sure they mitigate the risk that comes along with not understanding and then not actually even knowing when these laws may be coming down?
I think one of the things that I have found on this entrepreneurial journey and talking with other founders is that almost everyone, perhaps everyone in a certain sense, wants their company to be viewed as a good corporate citizen. And I think the more that, and wants to really take concrete steps to, in order to be a great corporate citizen. And I think it really goes back to connecting those two ideas, that this is really an existential challenge. As the leader of a corporation or an organization, you have, again, your fiduciary responsibility to your investors, but also to all the stakeholders of the organization to make the community that you live in and really exist through a better place. And so I think that's something that I try to keep in mind with my own organization and with our clients. And I think that just kind of connecting those two things is important.
Yeah,
Awesome.
Tony, we shared with the audience at the beginning how excited we were to be having this conversation, and it has been exactly what we hoped it would be. You've shared such great insights, again, building from that conversation in March. So thank you again for taking that time.
Absolutely.
But we cannot let you go without giving the audience a little bit more insight into the person behind the title, behind the role, behind that incredible accolade of helping to win the $2 billion for Power Forward Communities. First and foremost, perhaps most important question of the day is that we did hear some incredibly contentious news on the Purpose Venture Group LinkedIn feed, which is that apparently hot dogs are sandwiches. So that being sort of a blanket statement from the company, where do you personally stand on that question?
I don't think of it as a sandwich, but the company spoke, so what can I say?
Honestly, I have to agree. It's a separate category.
So, well, that's true. I can kind of see both ways, though.
Yeah.
Meat in between two pieces of bread.
Yeah.
Gets there.
This.
But something really close to my own heart, because I have a pretty firm opinion on it. But I've been now in New York almost 25 years. I'm not sure how long you've been in the city, but probably quite some time.
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah, 15 years.
Yeah. See. So you must have a very specific place in terms of what's your favorite place inside New York City.
Favorite place inside New York City? Wow. I would say Prospect Park. It's just a fantastic park. I live close in Windsor Terrace, and just being able to go to the park and be in a completely different world to the hustle and bustle of New York City.
That's so hilarious, because honestly, that's exactly my answer.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, that's why we get along.
Yeah,
That's why we're here.
love it.
I thought you were going to say that jazz place over.
It's
that you
also
went
true.
to.
Yeah, there's a lot of. I mean, the thing about New York City, you could name 100 places, and they would all be a favorite.
So now we're in Prospect Park, favorite place to be, and you have as the classic sort of icebreaker question for the audience who's getting to know you. While you're sitting in Prospect Park, you're having a dinner. You're having a dinner with any historical figure, dead or alive. Who is it, and what is the first question that you ask them?
Wow. This is a really great question. One of the things we were asking ourselves as we were in London, one of the events was at the National Portrait Gallery in London, and there is a really impressive collection of portraits from British history in that museum. And one of the things we were saying to ourselves is, what were the things that so many of these people did to get on the wall? There's famous figures like Jonathan Swift, of course, many kings and queens, but also folks who are not remembered to this day, and yet each of them did something in their own way to be memorialized in this National Museum. And so I think it's really, rather than I could pick so many famous people, but I think it might even be more interesting to just pick one who's nameless today, but just ask, what was the thing that you did, which was a little, tiny patchwork of the fabric of British history that now is remembered to this day, and what does that mean about what we can do as citizens to do the same thing?
That's a great answer.
Yeah,
I like that answer.
Yeah, it is. And it also, the reason why I like that answer as well is that it's not necessarily about, this particular thing, but it's about a moment in time and understanding kind of society at large.
Yes.
And I think that's just so important. And I think it's so important in basically why we're doing the work that we do. And so to kind of take a step back in terms of some of those particular questions, more personal questions, maybe could call them silly, talk about hot dogs, but and get a little bit more
Very serious.
yeah, exactly, and talk a little bit more a more kind of direct question. You've had an amazing career. You have a great company that you're basically running with a lot of accolades. So what advice would you actually give people in terms of, okay, well, what do you think that you've done right? What did you actually think that you would actually want to avoid? And then also, for those who are new to the industry, like where should they get started?
I think, so I love those two questions. I think as I'm thinking back to early in my career, I started in investment banking and then went to private equity. And I think both of those are really excellent training grounds for learning about how organizations work and what goes into them. And I think the thing that it took me perhaps a little while to realize is that everything is important. You can't ignore anything about a company. And some things might seem abstract or arcane, and it really depends on your own proclivity. Some people, don't really like or understand HR or don't have a sense of why it's important to an organization. I didn't really understand marketing when I started out, and I didn't understand why it's so fundamentally important to an organization. I should have wish I had met you both a lot earlier. Would have made that much easier. But there are just so many things that go into an organization, and I think wherever you're working when you start off, you're going to have a specialty likely, but having a view of why the organization exists as it does and why all the pieces play the role that they do is really something that, particularly if you have an aspiration to be a founder at some point later on, that really means taking responsibility for all those pieces.
Having a bit of breadth as well as the depth in your
Yes.
specialty.
Yep.
So that makes a difference. It's good advice. We're going to do something a little bit different for today's episode. It's actually an exchange of questions. And so we have a question for you from the team over at Raise Green. And what we're going to ask you to do is on that piece of paper that you have, we're going to ask you to write down the question for next week's guest. And so next week's guest, to tell the audience, is actually another fantastic guest that we're excited to bring on, is Jackie Logan, who's the interim CEO, the co-founder, and the chief investment officer of Raise Green. We'll get into more of the exciting work that they are doing with that platform, what a lot of the same sort of mission that we've just spoken about with Tony here today. And so the question for you, Tony, from the Raise Green team is really tied back to what Raise Green does specifically, which we'll get into, which is regulated crowdfunding. So when you think about the capital stack, and what is most beneficial for founders to be thinking about, especially earlier stage, where do you see Reg CF fitting within how they might want to think about things for either their ventures or projects? How does that kind of fit into the overall stack for you?
Definitely. It's got a critical role to play because I think one trend that we've seen more recently is that for early stage rounds, whether it's a pre-seed or a seed or even a Series A, the lead investor is not going to be likely more than 50% of the round, and perhaps not even more than 25, 30% of the round. And so that means that there is an investor that is making a really informed bet that folks who are coming in from a crowdfunding platform can really feel confident about investing behind. but that there's so much opportunity to fill out the round. And so it's as an investor, that's something that I get excited about, being able to piggyback off of great investors in the space. And I think it's an awesome opportunity that Race Green has created.
Awesome. And so we'll ask you to write down your question for Jackie. We won't tell the audience what the question is now. We'll share it with them next week when we actually have that conversation with Jackie. But all of that aside, now that we know where you stand on hot dogs and the capital stack, just wanted to again say thank you so much, Tony. It has been a pleasure as always. We are so grateful to have you on the stage here with us. And we're excited. Ryan and I are both excited to see what you and the team, what PVG at PFC, at all the acronyms, what you guys have in store in terms of how you're going to really continue to accelerate that impact and make the world a better place. Be good corporate citizens, as you said. For those in the audience who want to learn more about Tony, about Purpose Venture Group, or maybe want to leverage their services, you can head over to purposeventure.co. That link will also be in the show notes. It's on the website as well at Planet First Action. And if you want to get engaged with the Planet First Action community with this initiative, what we're doing here, you can head over to the website. It's planetfirstaction.com. We will also ask you to do, completely shamelessly by the way, to do all of the good social actions like share, subscribe, send to your mom, send to your friend, send to everybody. It really does make a big difference, and we are very appreciative of it. And again, just
no, please do join. It's a fantastic community. Jacob and Ryan, you've done a fantastic job putting it together. I'm thrilled to be a part of it. So thank you for having me.
Perfect. Well, again, thank you so much. I'll echo everything that Jacob said. So see you next time.